Norman Bates is a main character created by Robert Bloch as the main antagonist in his 1959 novel, Psycho, and portrayed by Anthony Perkins in the 1960 film of the same name directed by Alfred Hitchcock, and its sequels, and by Freddie Highmore in the television series Bates Motel. The character was inspired by Wisconsin murderer Ed Gein. Character overview. Both the novel and the 1960 film adaptation explain that Norman suffered severe emotional abuse as a child at the hands of his mother, Norma, who preached to him that sexual intercourse was sinful and that all women, except herself, were whores. The novel also suggests that their relationship may have been incestuous. After Norman's father, John Bates, died, Norman and his mother lived alone together, as if there was no one else in the world, until Norman reached adolescence, when his mother met Joe Considine, Chet Rudolph in Psycho IV, The Beginning, and planned to marry. Considine convinced Norma to open a motel. Driven over the edge with jealousy, Norman murdered both of them with strychnine. After committing the murders, Norman forged a suicide note to make it look as if Norma had killed her fiancé and then herself. After a brief hospitalization for shock, he developed dissociative identity disorder, assuming his mother's personality to repress his awareness of her death and to escape the feelings of guilt for murdering her. He inherited his mother's house, where he kept her corpse, and the family motel in the fictional small town of Fairvale, California. Bloch sums up Norman's multiple personalities in his stylistic form of puns. Norman, a child dependent on his mother. Norma, a possessive mother who kills anyone who threatens the illusion of her existence. And Normal, a functional adult who goes through the motions of day-to-day life. Norma dominates and belittles Norman, much as she had when she was alive, forbidding him to have friends and flying into violent rages whenever he feels attracted to a woman. Norma and Norman carry on conversations through Norman talking to himself and to her corpse in his mother's voice, and Norman dresses in his mother's clothes whenever Norma takes hold completely. Psycho. In Bloch's 1959 novel and the 1960 Hitchcock film, Marion Crane, a young woman on the run after stealing money from her employer, checks into the motel one night. Norman is smitten with her, and shyly asks her to have dinner with him in the house. Mother flies into a rage and threatens to kill Marion if Norman lets her in the house. Norman defies her and eats dinner with Marion anyway, but lashes out at her when she suggests that he institutionalize his mother. When Marion goes to her room to shower, Norman spies on her through a peephole he drilled in the wall. Mother takes control and stabs Marion to death. She beheads her in the novel. When Norman awakes to discover what he believes his mother has done, he sinks Marion's car, with her corpse and the money in the trunk, into a nearby swamp. As Mother, he also murders Milton Arbogast, a private detective hired by Marion's employer. Days later, Norman is finally caught when Marion's sister Lila, Vera Miles, and boyfriend, Sam Loomis, John Gavin, arrive at the motel looking for her. When Norman figures out what they want, he knocks Sam out and goes running after Lila, who has reached the house and found Mrs. Bates' corpse. He attacks her as Mother, but Sam overpowers him, and he is finally arrested. Norman is declared insane and sent to an institution, where Mother takes complete and permanent control of Norman's mind. He becomes his mother. In Bloch's 1982 sequel to his novel, Norman escapes from the psychiatric hospital by killing a nun and donning her habit. Picked up as a hitchhiker, Norman tries to attack the driver with a tire iron, but the driver overpowers him. This in turn causes a fiery accident where the driver escapes, but Norman dies. Norman's psychiatrist, Dr. Adam Claiborne, discovers Norman's body and assumes his personality. in Bloch's 1990 sequel to his second novel, Psycho House. Norman appears only as a novelty animatronic on display in the Bates Motel, which has been converted into a tourist attraction. In Bloch's 2016 prequel to his second novel, Psycho Sanitarium, Dr. Felix Reed tries to bring Norman out of a catatonic state. Sanitarium introduces Robert Newman, Norman's twin brother who was taken away at birth after the attending doctor pronounced him brain damaged. As Robert and Norman grow to know each other, Norman senses a darkness in Robert, even deeper than that which has lurked in Norman himself. Film sequels. Psycho 2. In 1983's Psycho 2, the first sequel to the original film, Norman is released from the institution 22 years after his arrest. Seemingly cured, he meets Mary Loomis, Meg Tilly, Marion Crane's niece, and falls in love with her. However, a series of mysterious murders occurs, as well as strange appearances and messages from Mother, and Norman slowly loses his grip on sanity. The mysterious appearances and messages turn out to be a plot by Mary's mother, Lila Loomis, to drive him insane again in order to get him recommitted. The actual murders turn out to be the work of Norman's coworker, Emma Spool, Claudia Breyer. Before Norman discovers this, however, Mary Loomis is shot dead by the police during a confrontation with Norman, and Spool murders Lila. When Spool tells Norman that she is his real mother, he kills her and embalms her body while assuming the mother personality once again. Psycho 3. In 1986's Psycho 3, Norman continues to struggle, unsuccessfully, against Mother's dominion. He also finds another love interest named Maureen Coyle, Diana Scarwood, who eventually dies at Mother's hand. In the film, Mrs. Spool's body is first discovered by sleazy musician Dwayne Duke, Jeff Fahey, whom Norman kills when Duke tries to use the discovery to blackmail Norman. Tracy Venable, Roberta Maxwell, a reporter interested in Norman's case, finds out the truth about Spool. Mother orders Norman to kill Tracy, but in the end he attacks Mother's corpse violently, attempting to break free of her control. He is then arrested and put back in the institution. During the last few minutes of the movie, Tracy tells Norman that Emma Spool was his aunt, not his mother, and had killed his father in a jealous rage when he chose Norma over her. After Norma gave birth to Norman, Emma kidnapped the child, believing he was her son. She was arrested and institutionalized, leaving Norman to be raised by Norma. Psycho IV, The Beginning. 1990's Psycho IV, The Beginning, the final film in the series, retcons the revelations of the second and third film, supplying that Norman's father was stung to death by bees and removing all references to Emma Spool. In this film, Norman has been released from an institution, and is married to one of the hospital's psychologists, a woman named Connie Donna Mitchell. When his wife becomes pregnant, he lures her to his mother's house and tries to kill her, wanting to prevent another of his cursed line from being born into the world. The film implies that Mrs. Bates, Olivia Hussey, suffered from schizophrenia and borderline personality disorder and passed the illnesses onto her son. However, he relents at the last minute. When Connie professes her love for him, he then burns the house down in an attempt to free himself of his past. During the attempt, he is tormented by hallucinations of Mother and several of his victims. He almost dies in the flames before willing himself to get out, apparently defeating his illness at long last. He is finally free of his mother's voice, which demands to be let out. This was Anthony Perkins' final performance as Norman Bates. Henry Thomas portrayed Norman as a teenager. Television. Bates Motel. In the 1987 television movie and series pilot Bates Motel, Norman is never released from the institution after his first incarceration. He befriends Alex West, Bud Cort, a fellow inmate who had murdered his stepfather, and wills ownership of the titular motel to him before dying of old age. Bates Motel. The TV series Bates Motel, a contemporary prequel to the 1960 film, premiered on March 18, 2013, on A&E. Set in the present day, it depicts the young Norman Bates' Freddie Highmore life with his mother, Norma Vera Farmiga. In this continuity, Norman suffers from hallucinations and blackouts, and begins manifesting his mother personality as a teenager. He kills his abusive father, Sam David Cubitt, while in a dissociative state, causing Norma to move them from Arizona, where he was born and raised, to White Pine Bay, Oregon, to protect him. The series also introduces his maternal half-brother, Dylan Massett, Max Fierro, and gives him a love interest in Emma D. Cody, Olivia Cook, a classmate with cystic fibrosis. As mother, Norman murders Blair Watson, Keegan Connor Tracy, one of his teachers who seduces him. After Norma marries Alex Romero, Nestor Carbonell, the town sheriff, Norman becomes insanely jealous and tries to kill both Norma and himself by flooding the house with carbon monoxide. Norma dies, but Norman survives. Characterization. The character Norman Bates in Psycho was loosely based on two people. First was the real-life murderer Ed Gein, about whom Block later wrote a fictionalized account, The Shambles of Ed Gein. In 1962, the story can be found in Crimes and Punishments, The Lost Block, Volume 3. Second, it has been indicated by several people, including Noel Carter, wife of Lynn Carter, and Chris Steinbrenner, as well as allegedly by Block himself, that Norman Bates was partly based on Calvin Beck, publisher of Castle of Frankenstein. The characterization of Norman Bates in the novel and the movie differ in some key areas. In the novel, Norman is in his mid to late 40s, short, overweight and homely. In the movie, he is in his mid-20s, tall, slender, and handsome. Reportedly, when working on the film, Hitchcock decided that he wanted audiences to be able to sympathize with Norman and genuinely like the character, so he made him more of a boy next door. In the novel, Norman becomes mother after getting drunk and passing out. In the movie, he remains sober before switching personalities. In the novel, Norman is well-read in occult and esoteric authors such as P.D. Ouspensky and Aleister Crowley. He is aware that Mother disapproves of these authors as being against religion. Portrayals. Norman Bates was portrayed by Anthony Perkins in Hitchcock's seminal 1960 film adaptation of Block's novel and its three sequels. Perkins hosted an episode of Saturday Night Live in 1976 in which he performed numerous sketches portraying Norman, including the instructional video, The Norman Bates School of Motel Management. He also portrayed Norman, albeit more lightheartedly, in a 1990 commercial for oatmeal crisp cereal. Vince Vaughn portrayed Norman in Gus Van Sant's 1998 remake, while Kurt Paul, Perkins' mother, stunt double in Psycho 2 and Psycho 3, took on the role in the made-for-TV film spin-off Bates Motel. Oz Perkins, Anthony's son, portrayed a younger version of Norman in Psycho 2. Henry Thomas played a younger version of the character in Psycho IV. The Beginning. Freddie Highmore portrays a younger version of Norman in the TV series Bates Motel. For his portrayal, Highmore won a People's Choice Award in 2017. Comic books. Norman appears in the 1992 three-issue comic book adaptation of the 1960 film Psycho released by Innovation Publishing. Despite being a colorized adaptation of the Hitchcock film, The version of Norman present in the comics resembles the one from Bloch's original novel. A middle-aged, overweight, balding man. Comic artist Felipe Echevarria has explained that this was due to Perkins' refusal to allow his likeness to be replicated for the books, wanting to disassociate himself with Norman Bates. Reception. Norman Bates is ranked as the second greatest villain on the American Film Institute's list of the top 100 film heroes and villains. Appearances. Novels, films, television, comics. Norman Bates is a main character created by Robert Bloch as the main antagonist in his 1959 novel, Psycho, and portrayed by Anthony Perkins in the 1960 film of the same name directed by Alfred Hitchcock, and its sequels, and by Freddie Highmore in the television series Bates Motel. The character was inspired by Wisconsinship may have been incestuous. After Norman's father, John Bates, died, Norman and his mother lived alone together, as if there was no one else in the world, until Norman reached adolescence, when his mother met Joe Considine, Chet Rudolph in Psycho IV, The Beginning, and planned to marry. Considine convinced Norma to open a motel. Driven over the edge with jealousy, Norman murdered both of them with strychnine. After committing the murders, Norman forged a suicide note to make it look as if Norma had killed her fiancé and then herself. After a brief hospitalization for shock, he developed dissociative identity disorder, assuming his mother's personality to repress his awareness of her death and to escape the feelings of guilt for murdering her. He inherited his mother's house, where he kept her corpse, and the family motel in the fictional small town of Fairvale, California. Bloch sums up Norman's multiple personalities in his stylistic form of puns. Norman, a child dependent on his mother. Norma, a possessive mother who kills anyone who threatens the illusion of her existence. Then murderer Ed Gein. Character overview. Both the novel and the 1960 film adaptation explain that Norman suffered severe emotional abuse as a child at the hands of his mother, Norma, who preached to him that sexual intercourse was sinful and that all women, except herself, were whores. The novel also suggests that their relationship